Welcome to an introduction to accounting, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For more information about Parkbench Tutors, look us up on parkbenchtutors.com or find us on Facebook, Parkbench Tutors. This short podcast deals with costing and looks at variances due to labour. Variance analysis is where we compare the actual costs with standard costs that have been calculated. Any difference is called a variance. And in managerial accounting, we look to identify the variances, find the causes of those variances, and obviously, if we can, determine whether the corrective action is needed and can be applied. Our example is Dream Designs, producing polar coats, and we have the costs for the production of a polar coat in terms of raw material, £5 a unit, 2 units, that's 10 kilograms per raw material. £10 an hour for labour, 4 hours of labour. Variable overheads, £5 an hour, 4 hours, and a fixed production cost of £30,000 and a budgeted production of 3,000 coats. We're going to look at the variances for a particular period of production, and here's our period. Our budgeted costs for 3,000 coats would have been 3,000 for raw materials, 120,000 for labour, 60,000 for raw materials, 30,000 for fixed costs, 3,000 is the budgeted production then. Our actual costs related to production of 3,600 coats, and we are going to look particularly at labour. And the actual cost of labour was 126,000, 13,000 hours were paid, only 11,500 were worked. We can ignore the other figures on the sheet. We're just going to focus on the labour. So if I look at the total labour cost variance, 3,600 coats at the standard rate, that is, working 4 hours per coat at £10 an hour, should have cost 144,000, but the actual cost was 126,000. My variance then is 18,000. And it is favourable. It's favourable obviously because the actual cost was less than the standard rate. And I'm looking at three things which could have caused that. My pay rate may not have been the same, there may have been idle time, and of course if we worked less hours that would mean that we were more efficient. So let's have a look at the rate of pay variance. The actual time paid at the standard rate should have cost 130,000, but we actually paid 126,000. So the rate variance is £4,000, and that's favourable. It's favourable because the actual amount paid was less than the standard cost. The idle time variance, well, the hours paid for were 13,000, but only 11,500 were worked. Therefore, there was 1,500 hours, which we call idle time. And at the standard rate, that equates to £15,000. Note that idle time is always adverse because it's non-productive time. The efficiency variance, well, this occurs if we work less hours than were actually needed according to our standard costs. So the hours needed normally for 3,600 coats would be 14,400, but we only worked 11,500. Note we're only interested now in the hours that were worked, not in the hours that were paid. So the efficiency variance here will be 14,400 minus 11,500, that's 2,900. So at £10 an hour the efficiency variance is 29,000, and that is favourable. Working fewer hours than the standard hours must be favourable. Okay, let's look at the two possible ways of reconciling this. The actual hours at the standard rate, 12,600, a rate variance of 4,000 that was favourable, an idle time variance, 15,000 which was adverse, and an efficiency variance of 29,000 which is favourable. We take the actual time, we add the favourable parts, we remove the adverse parts, and we end up with the standard cost. So 126,000 plus 4,000 minus 15,000 plus 29,000 gives 144,000. You can look at that the other way and reconcile it that way. 3,600 coats at the standard rate should have cost 144,000. So if we add the adverse ones to that, that's 15,000, and subtract the favourable ones, 4,000 and 29,000, we get back to 126,000, which was what was actually paid, the actual cost. That ends our podcast on variance for labour, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors, narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you success in your studies. If you want access to more of our podcasts, then go to parkbenchtutors.com and you may be able to gain access to some more free resources.